The morning mist clung to the grounds of Ashford House like a shroud, grey and cold and unrelenting, as the chapel bells tolled their melancholy cadence across the estate. 6 chimes, then silence, then 6 more, the same rhythm that had marked every dawn for 3 years, 1,095 mornings of measured, mechanical mourning. Lady Eleanor Ashford stood at her window as she always did at this hour, a figure carved from shadow and sorrow, her black mourning gown severe against the pale walls of her chamber, the fabric so familiar now it felt like a second skin, or perhaps a shroud she wore while still breathing. She was 26 years old, though the servants whispered she looked ageless in the way of those who have stopped living. Not young, not old, simply suspended, caught between the world of light and the realm of memory. 3 years. 3 years since the letter had arrived, bearing news that Captain Thomas Ashford's ship had gone down in a storm off the Portuguese coast, that her husband of barely 18 months had been claimed by the sea, that she was a widow before she had properly learned to be a wife. 3 years since she had worn any colour but black, since she had attended any gathering, since she had sung or danced or laughed without immediately crushing the impulse beneath the weight of what she owed to Thomas's memory. Her daily ritual had calcified into something immutable. Chapel at dawn, where she knelt on stones grown smooth beneath her knees, a solitary walk through gardens she no longer truly saw, breakfast taken alone in the small dining room, with its curtains drawn against the offence of sunlight, hours spent in needlework or reading without absorption, supper in the same dim room, then bed in chambers where his portrait watched her sleep. The villagers spoke of her in hushed tones. The widow who won't let go, they called her, the lady who's buried herself alive. Though they said it with pity rather than judgment, for everyone remembered how she and Thomas had been childhood sweethearts, how their wedding had been the grandest celebration the county had seen in a generation, how brief and bright their happiness had been before the sea swallowed it whole. Eleanor knew what they said, knew they watched her black-clad figure move through the village on her infrequent errands like a ghost haunting its own life, and some part of her, the part not frozen in that terrible November morning, when the letter came, understood they were right. She was not living. She was performing the motions of life, while her heart remained 3 years in the past, anchored to a moment of loss, as surely as Thomas's body was anchored to the ocean floor, and she could not fathom how to be otherwise, could not imagine what betrayal it would be to Thomas's love, to ever again choose joy, choose colour, choose the future over the beautiful, terrible past that was all she had left of him. Duke Sebastian Hartfield had never been a man prone to impulse or sudden fascination, his 34 years having been marked by scholarly restraint, careful deliberation, and the kind of measured existence that befitted a man of his station and temperament indeed. The county knew him as a reclusive figure, more likely to be found in his library than at social gatherings, a man who had never married despite his title and considerable fortune, who kept his own counsel and maintained his estates with quiet efficiency but little fanfare. It was therefore something of a mystery to him when, on a bright April morning alive with the riotous colours of spring blossoming cherry trees, shedding petals like pink snow, daffodils rioting in golden profusion along the lanes, the very air seeming to vibrate with green and growing things, he found his attention arrested completely by a single figure moving through the village high street, a woman dressed entirely in unrelieved black, so stark against the seasonal jubilation that she seemed almost an apparition, a rent in the fabric of the world through which winter still showed. He had reined in his horse without conscious thought, watching as she moved with slow, mechanical precision past shop windows she did not glance toward, past neighbors who greeted her with pitying gentleness she barely acknowledged, a woman moving through the world as though she walked under water, as though some great weight pressed upon her shoulders and made each step an act of will rather than ease. Sebastian found himself struck not merely by the contrast, though that was dramatic enough, this figure of mourning amid such insistent life, but by something in the way she held herself, a quality of determined endurance that suggested she was not naturally fragile, but had been made so by some great blow, that beneath the widow's weeds there existed a woman of substance who had been, through grief, reduced to shadow. He made inquiries, discreet as befitted his nature, and learned her story from the village apothecary. Lady Eleanor Ashford, widow these 3 years, her husband lost at sea, her mourning so absolute it had become a kind of imprisonment, a young woman who had simply stopped living when death claimed the man she loved. Sebastian listened to this recitation with a growing sense of something he could not quite name, not pity, precisely, though there was compassion in it, not merely curiosity, though he was intrigued, but rather a conviction that took root in his chest with startling firmness, that he could not somehow simply ride away and forget that figure in black, that woman drowning in grief while the world bloomed around her in indifferent beauty. He found reasons to return to the village over the following days, telling himself he was attending to estate business while knowing, with the part of himself that remained ruthlessly honest, that he was hoping to see her again, to understand what it was about her sorrow that called to something in his own carefully ordered heart. And on the third such visit he watched from his horse as she disappeared through the iron gates of Ashford House, swallowed by the shadows of an estate that seemed, even from the road, and to have drawn its curtains against joy. And Sebastian Hartfield, who had never pursued anything more romantic than a rare manuscript, felt something shift within him, a decision forming without words, a certainty that his path and hers were somehow meant to cross, that he had been given, for reasons he could not articulate, the task of calling her back from whatever cold shore she walked, back to the land of the living, though he had no notion yet of how such a thing might be accomplished, only that he must try. The village bookshop was a narrow establishment wedged between the apothecary and the draper's, its windows dusty and its interior dim, with the particular gloom that comes from too many books packed into too little space, and Eleanor had not visited it in months, her reading having become as mechanical as everything else in her life. The same volumes revisited without pleasure, words passing before her eyes without penetrating the fog that surrounded her thoughts. But on this particular May afternoon, she found herself drawn there by some impulse she did not examine, some restless need to be among the smell of paper and binding that had once brought her comfort. She moved through the cramped aisles with her usual slow precision, her black skirts whispering against the shelves, her gloved fingers trailing along leather spines without truly seeing the titles, until she found herself before the poetry section and reached, with the first flicker of genuine interest she'd felt in weeks, for a slim volume bound in green cloth Wordsworth, whose lines about nature and memory had once moved her to tears in a time when she could still feel such things fully. Her hand had barely touched the spine when another hand, larger and ungloved, reached for the same book from the opposite direction, and she withdrew as though burned, stepping back with a murmured apology, her eyes downcast as was her habit, but a voice low, cultured, unexpectedly gentle, said, "Forgive me, madam, the fault is entirely mine. Please, you were here first." Eleanor looked up then, and found herself meeting the gaze of a man she recognized from village glimpses, though they had never been introduced. The Duke of Hartfield, tall and scholarly in appearance, perhaps a decade older than herself, with eyes of remarkable kindness that seemed to see more than she wished to reveal, and she felt suddenly, acutely conscious of how she must appear to him, the worn fabric of her mourning dress, now 3 years old, and showing its age despite careful maintenance, the pallor of her skin that spoke of too many hours indoors, the thinness that came from eating without appetite, the whole picture of a woman who had become a ghost. "You are too kind, Your Grace," she managed, her voice rusty from disuse in social situations, "but I have the volume at home. Please, take it." He studied her for a moment with those disconcerting eyes, then reached past her and withdrew not one book but 2 copies of the same edition, presenting one to her with a slight bow. "Then we shall both have the pleasure," he said, and there was something in his tone, not pity, which she had learned to recognize and despise, but rather a quality of genuine interest, of seeing her as a person, rather than a tragic figure that made her fingers close around the book he offered. They spoke briefly, formally, about Wordsworth and the Romantics, about poetry's capacity to capture what prose could not, and Eleanor felt something stir beneath her frozen surface, some small ember of the animated, intellectually curious woman she had been before grief had buried her. And when he asked, with careful courtesy that gave her every opportunity to refuse, whether he might be permitted to call upon her at Ashford House, "For I find myself in want of stimulating conversation, and it seems we share similar literary tastes." She hesitated for so long. He had surely prepared himself for rejection, but then heard herself say yes, A single word that felt like the first crack in ice that had held solid for 3 winters, a small breach in the fortress of her mourning through which something dangerous and bright possibility might eventually find its way in. Sebastian arrived at Ashford House on a Thursday afternoon, when the June sky hung heavy with unshed rain, the air thick and grey in that particular way that presages storm, and as his carriage rolled up the curved drive, he observed what he had suspected from village gossip, but found nevertheless unsettling to witness directly. The house itself seemed to be in mourning, its windows curtained in dark fabric that permitted no glimpse of the interior, its door wreathed not with seasonal flowers, but left bare and sombre, the whole edifice presenting a face of determined withdrawal from the world, as though the building had contracted around its mistress's grief and now reflected it in stone and shadow. Eleanor received him in the drawing-room, a space that might once have been lovely but now existed in perpetual twilight, the mirrors covered with black cloth as custom dictated, the furniture shrouded in protective covers that gave the impression of ghosts sitting in arrangement around the walls, and she poured tea with hands that trembled slightly, whether from the unaccustomed presence of a visitor or from some deeper disturbance he could not say, while making small apologies for the state of the house that he gently waved aside. They spoke of literature at first, of the Wordsworth volume that had brought them together, and Sebastian watched with careful attention as Eleanor's voice, tentative at first and thin with disuse, gradually strengthened as she discussed a particular poem's treatment of memory and loss, her observations acute and well-considered, revealing a mind that grief had dulled but not destroyed, an intelligence that isolation had dampened but left fundamentally intact. He found himself genuinely engaged, not merely playing a part or pursuing a campaign of rescue, but truly interested in her thoughts on Coleridge's use of natural imagery, on Byron's romanticism, and on the ways that poetry captured what ordinary language could not hold, and he realized that beneath the widow's weeds and the practiced grief there existed a woman of substance and depth, whom he wished very much to know. Sebastian was careful to avoid any mention of her loss, any prodding toward topics that might cause pain, treating her instead as he would any intellectual equal with whom he wished to converse, and he noticed, though she perhaps did not, how she leaned forward slightly as she spoke, how animation briefly touched her pale features, how for moments at a time she seemed to forget the heavy black dress and the dim room, and became simply a woman engaged in ideas. The visit lasted precisely the socially acceptable duration, neither too brief to seem dismissive, nor too long to impose, and as he prepared to take his leave he extended, with careful casualness, an invitation. "Lady Eleanor, I wonder if you might do me the honor of visiting my library at Hartfield Manor. I have recently acquired a collection of first editions that I believe would interest you, including a rather remarkable illuminated manuscript of medieval poetry." He watched her face as he spoke, and saw the flicker of genuine interest warring with what he had already learned to recognize as her instinct toward refusal, toward the safety of isolation, and he added quietly, "There is no obligation, of course, but should you find yourself wishing for new reading material or simply a change of scene, please know that you would be most welcome," and left before she could formulate either acceptance or rejection, trusting that the seed had been planted, and that curiosity, that most persistent of human impulses, might eventually overcome fear. 3 weeks elapsed before Eleanor found the courage to accept Sebastian's invitation, 3 weeks during which the card he had left cream-colored, simply engraved with the direction to Hartfield Manor, and a single line about the library being available at her convenience, sat upon her writing desk like a question she could not answer. And when finally she penned her acceptance, it was on a morning when the walls of Ashford House seemed to press inward with particular oppression, and she thought, if she did not escape them, she might cease to exist entirely, might simply fade into the dark wallpaper and dim corners, until even her own servants forgot she had ever been substantial. The carriage ride to Hartfield took less than an hour, but felt like passage between worlds. The landscape gradually brightening as she travelled, the fields more verdant, the sky somehow wider, and when the manor came into view, she felt her breath catch at the sight of it. Golden stone, glowing in the afternoon sunlight, windows uncovered and gleaming, flower beds arranged in riots of colour that seemed almost aggressive in their vitality after her years of carefully maintained gloom. Sebastian met her at the entrance himself, dismissing formality in favor of genuine welcome, and she noticed how his face brightened at her arrival, how he seemed to stand taller, how there was an eagerness beneath his careful courtesy that touched something dormant in her heart. And when he led her through the entrance hall, all light and art and beauty, she had to resist the impulse to shield her eyes. So long had she dwelt in dimness. But it was the library that undid her entirely, that breached defenses she had not known were weakening. He opened double doors of polished oak, and she stepped into a space so magnificent it seemed conjured from dreams, a 2-story chamber with walls-lined floor to impossibly high ceiling, with books, thousands of them, tens of thousands, perhaps their spines creating a tapestry of colors and textures, leather and cloth, gilt and plain. And the room was flooded with light from tall windows that faced south and west, the sun streaming in to illuminate dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits, and there were deep chairs positioned for reading, and rolling ladders to reach the highest shelves, and small tables bearing fresh flowers, actual flowers, purple and yellow and white, and the scent of paper and leather, and something green and living, all mingled together until Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes at the overwhelming beauty of it, at the reminder that such beauty still existed in a world that had seemed to her composed only of shadows. Sebastian said nothing, simply let her stand and absorb it, and she was grateful for his silence, for the way he moved quietly to stand near one of the windows, giving her space to experience the room without observation, though of course he was observing, she knew this, could feel the quality of his attention, even with his gaze turned away. But it was observation without judgment, without expectation, the watching of someone who waited to see a flower bloom without demanding it do so on a schedule. She moved forward slowly, hesitantly, her black skirts whispering against the parquet floor, and reached out to touch the nearest shelf, her gloved fingers trailing along spines as they had in the village bookshop, but this time with genuine hunger, genuine curiosity, and she found herself pulling volume after volume, examining bindings, reading opening lines, losing herself in the sheer abundance of it. And when Sebastian quietly mentioned that she was welcome to borrow anything she wished, to come as often as she liked, and to treat the library as her own, she looked up at him with something dangerous stirring in her chest. Not quite joy, not yet, but perhaps the memory of what joy had once felt like, and said in a voice thick with emotion, "Thank you, Your Grace. You cannot know what this means." Though from the soft expression in his eyes she thought, perhaps he did know. Perhaps he understood exactly what he was offering her, which was not merely books but a sanctuary, a place where the woman she had been before grief might tentatively begin to remember herself. The hours slipped away, unmarked, as Eleanor explored the collection, and when finally she settled into one of the deep chairs with a first edition of Austen, a novelist she and Thomas had read aloud to each other in those brief, bright months of their marriage. Sebastian took a seat across from her with his own volume, and they read in companionable silence as the afternoon light mellowed into gold, and when she made a comment about a particular passage, and he responded with an insight that sparked her own thoughts, they fell into animated discussion, and Eleanor heard herself laugh, actually laugh. A small sound, rusty and surprised, but genuine at something clever he said about Mr. Darcy's pride, and the sound of her own laughter shocked her into silence, but Sebastian merely smiled, that gentle smile that seemed to see her and approve of what he saw, and said, "I have been hoping to hear that sound," and she realized with a mixture of fear and wonder that she had been at Hartfield for nearly 5 hours, that the sun was setting, that she had forgotten for stretches of time to remember her grief, and that this forgetting felt simultaneously like betrayal and like the first deep breath after years of suffocation. The pattern established itself with the gentle inevitability of seasons turning. Every Thursday afternoon Eleanor would arrive at Hartfield Manor, and every Thursday Sebastian would be waiting in his library with tea already prepared and some new volume he thought might interest her, and they would settle into what became their customary chairs, hers by the south window where the light was best, his across from her, where he could observe her face as she read and spoke and discussed literature and philosophy and history with an ease that grew more natural each week, and as spring surrendered to summer and the days lengthened and warmed, Eleanor found herself anticipating these visits with something that frightened her in its intensity, found herself choosing her readings during the week with an eye toward what might spark interesting conversation, found herself thinking as she dressed each Thursday morning, even in her unchanging black, about whether he might notice that she had pinned her hair slightly differently, or worn the jet brooch that had been her mother's, rather than the plain mourning pin she usually favored. It was during one of these Thursday visits, as June roses bloomed beyond the library windows and filled the air with their honey-sweet scent, that Sebastian finally asked about Thomas, not with the awkward curiosity of those who wanted details to gossip over, but with genuine gentleness, real desire to understand, and Eleanor found herself speaking of him for the first time since the funeral, describing how they had known each other since childhood, how their families' estates had neighbored each other, how she had loved him since she was 15 and he 17, how their marriage had been brief, barely 18 months before the naval commission that took him to sea, and the storm that took him from life, but incandescently happy, filled with laughter and books read aloud and plans for the future they would build together. And as she spoke, she wept, quietly, the tears sliding down her pale cheeks unchecked. And Sebastian sat motionless, bearing witness, not offering empty platitudes but simply present in her grief. And when finally she fell silent, exhausted by the telling, he said softly, he was blessed to be loved so completely, and something in those words, in the acknowledgement of her love as gift rather than burden, cracked something open in her chest. The weeks that followed were marked by a new intimacy between them, a deeper ease born of shared vulnerability, and Sebastian began to speak more of his own thoughts and experiences, and Eleanor began to look forward to Thursdays not merely as escape from Ashford House's gloom, but as the week's truest moments, the hours when she felt most alive, most herself, and it was this realization that brought with it a crushing wave of guilt. How could she feel alive in another man's presence when Thomas lay dead beneath cold earth? How could she anticipate Sebastian's smile and the sound of his voice, and the way he listened to her, as though her words mattered when she should be remembering only Thomas's smile, Thomas's voice, Thomas's attentive care, and one Thursday in late July, when Sebastian made some comment that struck her as particularly insightful, and she felt herself leaning forward eagerly to respond, felt something warm bloom in her chest that she recognized with horror as joy. She stood abruptly, cutting herself off mid-sentence, and said in a voice sharp with panic, I feel I betray him by experiencing any joy, Your Grace. I feel that every moment I am not actively grieving is a moment I am forgetting him, erasing him, allowing him to die a second death in my heart. And Sebastian rose also, setting aside his book, and regarded her with those steady grey eyes that seemed to see through all her carefully constructed defences, and asked quietly, Would he wish you to fade away, Eleanor? Would the man who loved you want you to become a ghost, a living monument to his death, rather than a testament to the love you shared? She could not answer, could only stand trembling in the golden afternoon light streaming through the library windows, could only shake her head helplessly, and Sebastian did not push, did not demand response, merely said, It is a question worth considering, and let her depart earlier than usual. And as Eleanor's carriage carried her back to Ashford House through the summer landscape, she sat with his question burning in her mind, like a candle in darkness, illuminating corners she had kept deliberately shadowed, and she knew even as she tried to dismiss it that it would haunt her, that he had named the thing she most feared to examine, which was whether her prolonged mourning honored Thomas's memory or dishonored his love by refusing the gift of life he could no longer possess. The invitation arrived on a Thursday morning in early August, when the air hung heavy with the promise of heat, and the gardens at Ashford House drooped listlessly, despite the gardener's faithful watering. A simple card in Sebastian's precise hand, asking if Eleanor might visit Hartfield that afternoon, not for the library but for the gardens, which were, he wrote, at their peak, and which he thought she might find of interest. And though Eleanor's first instinct was to decline, the library was safe, contained, a known sanctuary, while gardens meant openness and exposure and unpredictable beauty. She found herself penning an acceptance before she could examine too closely why the thought of disappointing him caused such discomfort. She arrived in her customary black, the fabric absorbing the August sun until she felt she might dissolve in the heat, and Sebastian met her, not at the main entrance but at a side gate that opened onto the east gardens, and the moment she stepped through that gate, she felt her breath catch, because she had entered a world of such riotous color that her years of monochrome existence seemed to recoil from it. Roses in every conceivable shade bloomed in profusion, their scent thick and sweet on the air, and there were towering delphiniums in blues so vivid they hurt to look at, and golden lilies, and purple lavender that hummed with bees, and her black-clad figure moving through this landscape was so starkly incongruous that she felt herself a blot of ink spilled across a watercolor painting. Sebastian walked beside her, saying little, allowing the garden itself to speak, and he led her deeper into the space until they reached a secluded area enclosed by hedges where a special bed had been prepared, and here, separated from the chaos of color elsewhere, grew only roses of the purest white, dozens of bushes, hundreds of blooms, ranging from tight buds to full-blown flowers that seemed to glow in the dappled shade, and Eleanor stopped at the sight of them, something tightening in her throat at their austere beauty. "I have been cultivating this variety for 3 years," Sebastian said quietly, moving to stand beside one particularly magnificent specimen, his fingers gentle on the petals. "Working with my head gardener to achieve this exact shade, not cream, not ivory, but true white, pure white." And he turned to look at her with an expression of such careful earnestness that she felt exposed, seen. And he continued, "White is not the absence of mourning, Eleanor. It is mourning transformed, grief that has passed through the fire and emerged, changed but not destroyed. And in many cultures it is the color of remembrance, and of honoring what was while acknowledging what is." She could not speak, could only stand trembling slightly in her hot black dress, surrounded by cool white blooms, and Sebastian moved closer, not touching her but near enough that she could see the hope and hesitation in his eyes, and he said, "Color is not betrayal, it is not forgetting, it is not replacement or dismissal or dishonor, it is simply the acknowledgement that life continues, that beauty still exists, that you still exist not merely as Thomas's widow but as Eleanor, as a woman with capacity for joy and growth and transformation." And he gestured to the white roses surrounding them, adding, "These blooms honor the past while living in the present. They are both memorial and celebration, both remembrance and renewal, and there is no contradiction in that duality." Eleanor felt tears sliding down her cheeks, felt the weight of his words and the care behind them, felt touched and terrified in equal measure because he was asking something of her not explicitly, not yet. But the invitation was there in the symbolism of the garden, in the white roses he had spent years cultivating, in the gentle insistence that she could honor Thomas while still choosing to live, and she was not ready, not yet, could not yet imagine herself in anything but black, without feeling she was stripping away the only identity that had sustained her through 3 years of emptiness. And so she said, voice rough with emotion, "They are beautiful, Your Grace, truly beautiful, and I understand what you are saying, but I cannot. Not yet. I am not ready." And Sebastian nodded, no disappointment visible in his expression, only patience, infinite patience, and replied, "I know. I am not asking you to be ready now, only planting a seed, showing you that another way exists when you are prepared to see it." But as Eleanor departed Hartfield that afternoon, casting one last look back at the enclosed garden of white roses, she felt troubled in a way that kept her wakeful that night, and many nights following, because he had shown her a vision of transformation, and she could not unsee it. It could not return completely to the certainty of her mourning, and the question he had planted bloomed in her mind, like those white roses, persistent and beautiful, and impossible to ignore. The days following Eleanor's visit to the White Rose Garden brought a reckoning she could no longer avoid, a truth that crystallized in the sleepless hours of dark August nights when she lay in her bed at Ashford House and admitted to herself what she had been denying for weeks, that the anticipation she felt each Thursday was not merely for literature and conversation, but for Sebastian himself, for the way his eyes warmed when she entered a room, for the care with which he listened to her thoughts, as though they mattered profoundly, for the gentleness of his presence that made her feel seen and valued in ways she had not felt since Thomas's death. And this realization brought with it such crushing horror that she rose from her bed and paced her darkened chamber like a caged thing, whispering to herself, "No, no, I cannot, I must not. This is betrayal, this is replacement. This means Thomas's love was not eternal, not enough, that I am faithless and false and unworthy of the devotion I claim to feel." and the guilt that descended upon her was suffocating in its totality, a weight that pressed against her chest until she could barely draw breath. She understood with terrible clarity that she was developing feelings for Sebastian that went far beyond friendship or gratitude, that when she dressed on Thursday mornings she was thinking of him, that when she read during the week she was imagining his response to passages she found meaningful, that she had begun to care what he thought of her in ways that had nothing to do with intellectual companionship and everything to do with the treacherous stirrings of her heart, and this knowledge felt like violence against Thomas's memory, against the vows she had spoken, against the 3 years of faithful mourning that had defined her existence since his death. On the Tuesday following the garden visit, Eleanor sat at her writing desk with shaking hands and composed a formal note to Sebastian, declining any further visits, citing vague concerns about propriety and the need to attend to estate matters, her words stiff and impersonal, a retreat behind the walls of formality she had briefly allowed to crumble, and she sealed the note quickly before courage could fail her and dispatched it with a servant, and then she returned to her chamber and wept with a desolation that rivaled the early days of her widowhood, because she was losing something precious, even as she convinced herself the loss was necessary. In the weeks that followed, she returned to the strictest observance of her mourning rituals with an almost desperate fervor, as though by performing them perfectly she could atone for her emotional transgression. She attended chapel not once but twice daily, spent hours kneeling at the small altar in her private sitting room where Thomas's portrait hung, wore only her most austere black garments, without even the small vanities of the jet brooch or different arrangements of her hair, took her meals in solitude and spoke to her servants only when absolutely necessary, walked Thomas's favorite paths in the garden, and forced herself to remember, to actively conjure his face and voice and touch, lest she dishonor him further by allowing those memories to fade. But the strange and terrible thing was that the memories seemed less vivid now than they had been, as though her time with Sebastian had introduced some competing current that made it harder to hear Thomas's voice clearly, and this realization only deepened her guilt and renewed her determination to withdraw completely from any contaminating influence. The village noticed her increased reclusiveness, whispered that the widow Ashford had retreated even further into her mourning, that she was becoming more ghost than woman, that it was unnatural for one so young to remain so determinedly separate from life. And Mrs. Weatherby, who kept the draper's shop, remarked to anyone who would listen that Lady Ashford had the look of someone fading, that her skin had gone translucent and her eyes hollow, that she moved through the world as though already half departed from it, and these observations were relayed back to Eleanor by her lady's maid, who worried over her mistress's declining state, but received only cold dismissal for her concern, because Eleanor had made her choice and would not be swayed from it, would not allow herself to be tempted back toward the dangerous warmth of Sebastian's friendship and whatever treacherous feelings lay beneath it. The weeks following Eleanor's withdrawal became months, as summer faded into autumn and the September rains gave way to October's crisp brilliance, and then November's grey chill, and through all this turning of seasons, Sebastian maintained a silence that was not absence, but rather a different kind of presence, a patient waiting that manifested in gestures so subtle Eleanor might have missed them had she not been attuned, despite herself, to any sign of him. The first gesture came a week after her formal note of decline, when she found on her doorstep a volume she had mentioned in passing during one of their library conversations, a collection of metaphysical poetry she had loved in her youth, and tucked between its pages was a single pressed white rose petal, and nothing more. No note, no demand, just this quiet offering that she carried to her chamber and wept over before placing it carefully on her bedside table where she could see it each morning upon waking. The gifts continued at irregular intervals, never intrusive, never demanding response. A new novel by an author they had discussed, a botanical sketch of autumn leaves rendered in exquisite detail, a volume of philosophy with a passage about transformation marked by a silk ribbon, and always there were the pressed flowers, white roses giving way to autumn's golden leaves and late-blooming asters, each one a small insistence that beauty persisted, that the world continued its cycles, regardless of her retreat from it, and Eleanor received these offerings with emotions she could not untangle, gratitude and resentment and longing all twisted together, because part of her wished he would simply let her fade in peace, while another part, a part she tried desperately to ignore, treasured each gift as evidence that she had not been forgotten, that someone in the world still saw her as worthy of consideration. With some of the books came brief notes written in Sebastian's precise hand, never personal, never pressing, but containing quotations that spoke to her condition with uncanny accuracy. A line from Marcus Aurelius about the necessity of change, a passage from Julian of Norwich about all manner of things being well, a verse from the Psalms about weeping enduring for a night, but joy coming in the morning. And Eleanor read these fragments alone in her chamber, often late at night when sleeplessness gripped her, and she would trace the words with trembling fingers and feel the careful attention behind them. The way he was speaking to her across the distance she had imposed, not arguing or pleading, but simply offering alternatives to the narrative of eternal grief she had constructed. Her internal battle intensified rather than resolved during these months of separation, because his absence made her realize how much she had come to depend on his presence, how the weekly visits had become the architecture around which she organized her time. And without them, she felt more lost than ever, caught between the loyalty she owed to Thomas's memory and the undeniable pull toward Sebastian, toward life, and toward the possibility of transformation he represented. And it was in this state of painful suspension that the dreams began. Fragments at first, disjointed images of Thomas that left her weeping upon waking, but then one night in late November, as the first frost silvered the gardens, she dreamed with unusual vividness that Thomas stood before her in his naval uniform, not as he had been in death, drowned, absent, irretrievable, but as he had been in life, young and vibrant and smiling, and he took her hands and said with perfect clarity, "Eleanor, my love, you were never meant to follow me into darkness. You were meant to carry forward into light what we built together, and that means living, truly living, not this half-existence you have chosen." And though she knew upon waking that it was only a dream, only her own mind speaking to itself, she felt something loosen in her chest, some iron band of guilt that had constricted her breathing for months, and she rose and went to her window and looked out at the frost-covered grounds and whispered to the memory of her husband, "I do not know if I can, but perhaps I can try." And it was the first concession she had made, the first acknowledgement that the path she had been walking might not be the only path, might not even be the right path. And though she was not yet ready to act on this recognition, the seed Sebastian had planted in the white rose garden had finally, after months of resistance, begun to take root in the frozen soil of her heart. The storm arrived on the third week of November with a violence that seemed to tear the very fabric of the sky, dark clouds massing over the county like an invading army, and by afternoon the rain came in sheets so thick that visibility extended no more than a few yards, the wind howling around Ashford House with such ferocity that Eleanor could hear shutters rattling and tree branches scraping against windows like skeletal fingers seeking entrance, and she moved through her dim corridors with growing unease as the servants rushed to secure doors and place buckets beneath leaks that had opened in the aging roof, the house groaning under the assault as though it too were weary of standing against the elements. And then, as evening fell and the storm intensified rather than abated, young Maggie the kitchen maid came running to report that water was rising in the low fields, that the river had breached its banks, that the groundskeeper said the cellars would flood within hours, and perhaps the lower floors as well, and Eleanor felt a flutter of real fear because Ashford House sat in a natural depression that made it vulnerable to such flooding, and she was directing servants to move valuables to the upper floors when she heard the sound of a carriage arriving, heard urgent voices in the entrance hall, and descended to find Sebastian there, dripping rainwater onto her marble floors, his greatcoat soaked through, his face etched with concern as he spoke rapidly to her butler about the danger, about how he had ridden out personally when he realized the flooding would reach her estate, about how she must come with him immediately to Hartfield Manor, which sat on higher ground and would weather the storm safely. Eleanor's first instinct was refusal, a reflexive retreat behind the walls of propriety and self-imposed isolation. She could not possibly accept such an invitation, could not place herself under his roof, could not allow herself to be drawn back into his orbit when she had worked so hard to maintain distance. But even as she opened her mouth to decline, she saw the genuine alarm in Sebastian's eyes, heard her steward confirming that the situation was indeed dire, that the house might not be safe through the night, and she understood with sudden clarity that this was not a matter of social convention or emotional protection, but of practical survival, that she could not let pride or fear endanger herself and her household, and so she found herself nodding, accepting, instructing her senior servants to secure what they could and then seek shelter in the village, while she allowed Sebastian to lead her to his carriage, the rain immediately soaking through her black cloak as they dashed across the drive, the wind nearly tearing her from her feet before Sebastian's strong hand caught her elbow and steadied her into the vehicle. The journey to Hartfield Manor was brief but harrowing, the carriage rocking in the wind, rain drumming on the roof like artillery fire, and Eleanor sat across from Sebastian in the dim interior, acutely aware of his presence, of the impropriety of their situation, of the way circumstances had demolished in moments the careful distance she had maintained for months. And when they finally arrived and he handed her down into the sheltered courtyard, when the great doors of Hartfield opened and warm light spilled out to meet them, she felt her resistance crumbling, like the riverbanks that had given way to the flood, felt herself being swept into something she could no longer control. And as Sebastian's housekeeper led her to a suite of rooms prepared with extraordinary swiftness, as she found herself divested of her sodden cloak and given warm towels and dry garments, and told that dinner would be served whenever she felt ready, Eleanor stood alone in the firelit chamber and understood that the storm outside had merely given permission to the storm that had been building within her for months, that she had been brought here not just by wind and rain, but by forces far more powerful, by the relentless current of life itself, insisting that she could not remain forever on the shore, and that Sebastian's arrival at her door in the tempest had been not an intrusion, but a rescue. And perhaps she had needed rescuing all along. The storm raged through that night and into the next day and the day after that, 3 days during which Eleanor found herself suspended in a strange intimacy she had not anticipated, stranded at Hartfield Manor, not just by floodwaters, but by the collapse of all the careful distance she had maintained, and on the first evening after dinner, Sebastian invited her to the library, where a fire blazed against the November cold, and they sat in companionable silence at first, the storm howling beyond the windows, until he began to speak in a voice she had never heard from him before, quiet and tinged with an old sorrow that made her look up from her book and truly see him, perhaps for the first time, not as her patient would-be savior, but as a man who carried his own wounds, his own darkness, and he told her about his sister, Catherine, younger by 4 years, brilliant and beautiful and full of laughter, who had died at 19 of a fever that came sudden and merciless, and how he had been traveling abroad when it happened, how he had returned to find her already buried, how the guilt of his absence had carved something hollow in his chest that nothing could fill. "I wore black in my heart for years," Sebastian said, staring into the flames, his profile etched in sharp relief by the firelight. "Though I continued to move through society, to manage my estates, to do all the things expected of a duke, but I was not truly present, Eleanor. I was performing the motions of life, while the essential part of me remained locked in that moment when I stood at her grave and understood I would never hear her voice again, never see her smile, never have the chance to tell her I was sorry for not being there when she needed me most." Eleanor felt tears rising, not just for his loss but for the recognition of her own pattern reflected in his words, and when he turned to look at her, his eyes were luminous with unshed emotion, and he continued, "It was my steward, an elderly man who had known me since birth, who finally said to me, 'Your Grace, Lady Catherine would not wish to see you thus. She who loved life so fiercely would be heartbroken to know you had stopped living in her name.' And though I was angry at first, though I dismissed his words as presumptuous, they worked in me like a splinter I could not extract, and gradually I came to understand that my prolonged mourning was not honoring Catherine, but rather betraying everything she had stood for, that the truest tribute I could offer her memory was not to join her in death but to live fully, to carry forward the joy and wonder she had embodied, to allow her love to coexist alongside new loves, new experiences, new chapters of a life she would have wanted me to embrace." He paused, reached across the small space between their chairs, and for the first time touched her hand, his fingers warm and solid against her cold ones, and Eleanor felt something break open inside her, all the tears she had held frozen for 3 years suddenly thawing and flowing, and she wept as she had not wept, even at Thomas's funeral, great shuddering sobs that shook her entire frame, and Sebastian moved to kneel before her chair, holding both her hands now, not speaking, just present, just witnessing her grief without trying to fix it or stop it or rush it toward resolution. And in that moment, Eleanor understood that this was what she had needed all along, not someone to argue her out of her sorrow or shame her for its duration, but someone who had walked a similar path and emerged not by forgetting or replacing, but by the harder, braver work of allowing life alongside memory. And when her tears finally subsided and she looked into Sebastian's face, still so close to hers, she saw reflected there not pity but understanding, not pressure but patience, and something shifted between them. Some barrier that had been made of ice and shadow dissolved in the warmth of the fire and the truth of shared suffering. And though neither spoke of love that evening, though Sebastian returned to his chair, and they sat in silence as the storm continued, its assault on the world beyond the walls, Eleanor felt for the first time in 3 years that she was not entirely alone, that perhaps the path forward was not one she had to walk in solitary darkness, and that the hand Sebastian had offered was not asking her to abandon Thomas, but rather to honor him by choosing to continue the journey of living. The weather broke on the 4th morning, pale sunlight filtering through tattered clouds that raced eastward as though fleeing the scene of devastation. And when Sebastian's steward brought word that the roads were passable and the floodwaters receding, Eleanor felt a peculiar sinking in her chest, a sensation she recognized with some shame as disappointment for the storm had created a suspension of ordinary rules, a pocket outside of time where she and Sebastian had existed in an intimacy that her return to Ashford House would shatter. And as she prepared to depart, as the housekeeper helped her into her black cloak now cleaned and dried, she moved slowly as though through deep water, reluctant to break the surface into the cold air of normal life. Sebastian accompanied her in the carriage, propriety demanding he see her safely home, and they rode in weighted silence, the landscape passing outside the windows ravaged by the storm, trees stripped of their remaining leaves, fields muddy and littered with debris, fences collapsed. And Eleanor thought how the external destruction mirrored something internal, how the 3 days at Hartfield had torn down structures within her that she had believed permanent, and she did not know whether to be grateful or terrified. When they arrived at Ashford House, the damage was evident but not catastrophic. The lower floors had indeed flooded, watermarks staining the walls, rugs ruined, furniture warped, but the structure stood, and her servants were already at work with mops and buckets, and Sebastian insisted on surveying the damage with her steward before he would consider leaving, walking through the sodden rooms with a practical concern that touched Eleanor, even as it made her acutely aware that soon he would go, would return to Hartfield, would leave her alone in this damaged house, and the prospect felt suddenly unbearable. Their parting in the entrance hall was formal, observed by servants. But when Sebastian took her hand in farewell, his grip lingered, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch, and he said quietly, "You need not be alone in this, Eleanor, in the repairs. Please allow me to send workers to assist." But they both knew he meant something far broader than flood damage, and she nodded because she could not trust her voice. And then he was gone, the sound of his carriage fading down the drive, and Eleanor stood in her ruined entrance hall and felt the walls of Ashford House close around her, like a tomb she had willingly sealed herself within, felt the familiar darkness descend, except now it was no longer familiar, now it was oppressive, suffocating, wrong. That evening she walked through the upper floors, where the damage had not reached, through rooms she had kept shrouded and dim for 3 years, and on impulse she went to her chamber and pulled the Holland cover from the mirror that stood in the corner, the mirror she had not looked into properly since Thomas's death, and in the lamplight she saw herself clearly for perhaps the first time in all those long months. And what she saw horrified her, not because she was ugly but because she looked dead, her face pale as candle wax, her eyes enormous and haunted in their hollows, her black dress hanging on a frame grown thin, her hair severely pulled back, and she looked like a woman who had drowned, who had gone down into dark water and never surfaced, and the realization struck her with the force of physical blow. Asterisk, I am no longer living. I am haunting my own life, asterisk, and she understood that Thomas had died 3 years ago, but she had chosen to die with him, had chosen to become a ghost, drifting through empty rooms, and Sebastian's patient presence. These past months had not been an intrusion, but a hand extended from the world of the living to the realm of shadows, where she had taken up residence, an invitation to return, to choose breath over suspension. And standing there before her reflection in the damaged house, water-stained and storm-ravaged, Eleanor felt for the first time the terrible possibility that she could continue this half-death indefinitely, that she could waste every remaining year given to her, that she could let grief consume not just her past but her future. And the question that rose unbidden was the one Sebastian had asked months ago in his library. Asterisk, would Thomas wish this? Asterisk, and she knew with crushing certainty that he would not. That the man she had loved with such devotion had been full of life and laughter, and would be heartbroken to see what she had made of herself in his name, and the decision that had been forming through 3 days of storm and confession and breaking walls began to crystallize into something solid, something real, though she did not yet know what shape it would take or how long the transformation would require, only that she could not continue as she had been, that something essential had shifted and could not be shifted back, and that Sebastian had somehow become necessary to whatever came next, and the recognition of her need for him was both frightening and strangely, tentatively liberating. Winter descended upon the countryside with unusual severity that year, frost claiming the landscape in early December and refusing to release it. Bare trees etched stark against skies the color of pewter, and Eleanor moved through the cold rooms of Ashford House, feeling the season's chill settling into her very bones. Yet something had changed in her movements, a new awareness in the way she paused before windows or caught her own reflection in the mirrors she had uncovered, as though she were observing herself from outside, seeing what Sebastian must see, what Thomas would see if he could look upon her now, and the vision troubled her. When the invitation arrived from Hartfield Manor in mid-December, an elegantly scripted card inviting her to the Duke's annual Christmas gathering, Eleanor held it in trembling hands and felt panic rise in her throat, the thought of a crowded drawing room, of polite society's scrutiny, of being on display in her widow's weeds while others wore festive colors, was more than she could contemplate, and she penned a careful refusal, regretting that she could not attend, citing the continued repairs at Ashford House as her excuse, though they both would know it for the evasion it was. Sebastian's response came 2 days later, not a rebuke but another invitation, simpler, more intimate. Would she consider joining him for Christmas Eve dinner? Just the two of them, no crowds, no expectations, merely 2 friends sharing a meal on a holy night when no one should be alone. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, her heart performing strange acrobatics in her chest, and she thought of refusing this as well, of maintaining the safety of distance. But the memory of those 3 storm-bound days haunted her, the warmth of his library and his confession, and the feeling of being truly seen by another human soul. And before she could retreat into fear, she wrote her acceptance, her hand shaking as she sealed the envelope. The days that followed were marked by a peculiar anxiety Eleanor had not experienced since her girlhood, a nervous anticipation that made her restless and strange to herself, and on an impulse she could not fully explain. She summoned the dressmaker from the village, a widow herself who had always been kind, and when the woman arrived, Eleanor asked her to bring samples of fabric, something suitable for a widow in her 4th year of mourning, something that might be, and here her voice faltered, something that might be grey, perhaps, or lavender, the colours of half-mourning that she had never permitted herself to consider. The dressmaker's eyes widened, but she asked no questions, returning the next day with bolts of fabric in shades Eleanor had not worn since Thomas's death. Dove grey, soft as cloud, charcoal threaded with silver, a pale lavender that reminded her of twilight, and Eleanor touched them with fingers that trembled, feeling the textures, imagining herself in something other than unrelieved black, and she ordered 3 yards of the grey, the darkest shade, the smallest possible step. Though even as she did so, her heart hammered with what felt absurdly like guilt, like betrayal, like a door opening that she had kept nailed shut. But when the fabric arrived and lay across her bed like captured stormlight, Eleanor found she could not bring herself to have it made up, could not quite take that final step, and so it remained untouched while Christmas Eve approached, and she told herself it did not matter, that Sebastian would not judge her for appearing still in black, that the fabric had been merely an experiment, a thought she need not act upon, though she found herself going to her chamber repeatedly just to look at it, to touch it, to imagine. Christmas Eve arrived clear and bitterly cold, the kind of crystalline winter night when stars seemed close enough to touch, and breath froze in the air like visible ghosts, and Eleanor stood before her mirror in the black silk gown. She had chosen, the grey fabric still lay untouched in its wrapping, a promise she could not yet keep, and told herself that Sebastian would understand, that he had never asked her to be anything other than what she was. Yet, as her carriage carried her through the frozen landscape toward Hartfield Manor, she felt the weight of her mourning dress like chains, like a prison she had built so carefully around herself that she no longer knew how to find the door. Hartfield blazed with light against the darkness, every window golden and welcoming, and when Sebastian met her at the entrance, his face lit with such unguarded warmth that Eleanor felt something twist painfully in her chest, and he took her cloak with his own hands, a breach of protocol that would have scandalized in any other context, and said simply, "You came," as though her presence were a gift beyond price, and she saw in his eyes no judgment of her black dress, no disappointment, only a profound gladness that made her throat tighten with emotions she dared not name. He led her not to the formal dining room but to a smaller chamber she had not seen before, intimate and warm, where a table had been set for two, before a great fireplace that cast dancing shadows across walls, decorated with arrangements of white flowers, roses from his greenhouse, branches of white winter jasmine, clusters of paper whites that filled the air with their heady perfume, and white candles everywhere, dozens of them, their flames steady in the still air, and the effect was not of ostentation but of quiet beauty, a celebration rendered in light and shadow that somehow honored rather than mocked her mourning. And Eleanor stood transfixed, understanding that Sebastian had created this space specifically for her, a room where her black dress would not seem a rejection of joy, but rather a counterpoint to it, darkness and light existing together without contradiction. Dinner was simple but exquisite, each course perfectly prepared, and they spoke of literature and philosophy as they always had, yet beneath the familiar rhythm of their conversation ran a current of something deeper, something unspoken, but present in every glance, every pause, and Eleanor found herself watching Sebastian's hands as he gestured, the way firelight caught in his dark hair, the fine lines at the corners of his eyes that appeared when he smiled. Hands, she thought, with a kind of wonder that she was noticing him not as a friend or benefactor, but as a man, and the recognition did not fill her with guilt as she had expected, but rather with a tentative, frightening hope. When the meal ended, Sebastian rose and extended his hand, and when she looked at him in question, he said, "There is something more I would show you, if you will trust me." And Eleanor placed her hand in his, and let him lead her through corridors to the ballroom. Those great doors opening onto a space transformed, the chandeliers blazing, and the floor polished to mirror brightness, and in the corner, a single musician with a violin, an older man who nodded to Sebastian, as though he had been expecting this, and Sebastian turned to Eleanor with such tenderness in his expression that she felt tears prick her eyes, and he said quietly, formally, "Lady Ashford, would you do me the honor of this dance?" And Eleanor stood frozen, her heart hammering, because she had not danced since Thomas, and had not allowed music or movement or the simple joy of her body in motion since the day she received word of his death. And the thought of dancing now felt like crossing some final threshold, like stepping from one life into another, and she was not certain she possessed the courage. Yet Sebastian waited with infinite patience, his hand still extended, and finally, trembling, she placed her palm against his, and let him lead her onto that vast empty floor where they would dance alone, observed by no one but the musician and the watching portraits and whatever ghosts Eleanor carried with her. And as Sebastian's hand settled at her waist and the violin began its sweet, haunting melody, Eleanor felt as though she stood at the edge of an abyss, poised between the death she had chosen and the life that beckoned, and she did not yet know which way she would fall. The violin's melody wrapped around them like silk, and Sebastian's hand at Eleanor's waist was warm through the fabric of her black gown, steady and patient as he guided her into the first steps, and Eleanor moved as though in a dream, her body remembering what her mind had forbidden, the rhythm of the waltz coming back to her like a language she had spoken fluently once and thought forgotten, and for the first few measures she managed to hold herself apart, to maintain the careful distance she had preserved for 3 years. But then the music swelled, and Sebastian drew her infinitesimally closer, and suddenly she was not dancing with Sebastian at all, but with Thomas, 19 years old in their first London season, laughing as he spun her too fast across a crowded ballroom, and then Thomas on their wedding day, holding her as though she were made of spun glass and infinite value, and Thomas in their drawing room late one night when he had come home on leave, and they had danced without music, simply for the joy of being in each other's arms, and the memories crashed over Eleanor like a wave, threatening to pull her under, and she stumbled, her breath catching on what might have been a sob, and she tried to pull away because she could not do this, could not hold these memories and this present moment in the same heart. But Sebastian's arms tightened just enough to steady her without constraining her, and he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the violin, "Eleanor, breathe, just breathe with me." And she realized he was matching his breath to the rhythm of the music, slow and deep and measured, and without thinking she began to mirror him. Inhale on 1, 2, 3, exhale on 1, 2, 3, and the panic receded enough that she could continue moving. And Sebastian said, still in that low, steady voice that somehow anchored her, "You can hold both. Eleanor, the past and the present. You do not have to choose between remembering him and living now. The heart is vast enough for all of it." And something in those words pierced through the terror, and Eleanor found herself looking up into Sebastian's face, really looking at him, seeing the tenderness there and the longing and something deeper, something like reverence, and she understood in that moment that he was not asking her to forget Thomas or replace him or pretend those years had not existed. He was simply asking her to make room for something new alongside what had been, to expand rather than replace, and the distinction mattered more than she could articulate. They continued to dance, the ballroom vast and empty around them, only the musician in his corner and the candlelight casting their joined shadow long across the polished floor, and gradually Eleanor felt something loosening in her chest, some knot of grief and guilt that had pulled so tight she had forgotten it was there, and she realized she was crying, tears sliding silently down her cheeks, but she did not stop dancing, did not pull away, and Sebastian said nothing about her tears, simply continued to guide her through the steps with infinite gentleness, and the dance became something other than mere movement, became a conversation without words, became a kind of healing. And when the violin finally drew out its last lingering note, and they stood still in the center of that golden space, Eleanor was breathless not from exertion, but from the magnitude of what had shifted inside her, and they remained there, his hand still at her waist, hers still on his shoulder, standing so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could see the pulse beating at his throat, and the longing that rose in her then was so intense it frightened her, not guilt now but pure desire to close the small distance between them, to feel his lips on hers, to choose life and warmth and this man who had waited with such patience, and she saw the same longing mirrored in Sebastian's eyes, saw him lean toward her almost imperceptibly. But then he stopped, drew back slightly, and said with visible effort, "I should return you to the drawing room." And Eleanor understood that he was giving her time, not pushing, leaving the choice always with her, and she loved him for it even as she ached with wanting, and she nodded, not trusting her voice, and he stepped back and offered his arm with perfect formality, as though they had not just stood on the knife's edge of transformation, as though her world had not just tilted on its axis, and they walked together through the quiet corridors of Hartfield Manor. And Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that everything had changed, that the woman who had entered this house in mourning black was not the same woman who would leave it, and she was terrified and exhilarated and alive in a way she had not been for 3 long years, and when Sebastian handed her into her carriage at evening's end, and their fingers touched in farewell, Eleanor felt the spark of it travel up her arm and lodge somewhere in the vicinity of her heart, and she carried it home like a candle flame cupped carefully in her palms, precious and fragile and full of light. January arrived with cruel cold and crystalline skies, the world locked in frost. Yet something had shifted in Eleanor, something fundamental and irrevocable, and on the first day of the new year, she rose before dawn and walked through Ashford House, opening curtains she had kept drawn for 3 years, letting pale winter light flood rooms that had lived in perpetual twilight, and the brightness hurt her eyes, but she did not turn away. And when she passed the mirror in the upper hallway, the one she had covered with black cloth the day after Thomas's death, she stopped, and after a long moment of gathering courage, she reached up and pulled the fabric away, and it fell to the floor in a whisper of silk. And Eleanor stood facing her own reflection for the first time in years, when really looking, and what she saw shocked her. Not the young bride Thomas had left behind, but a woman aged by grief, hollow-cheeked and pale, her dark hair still beautiful but her eyes haunted, and she thought with sudden clarity that Thomas would not recognize this ghost, would be horrified to see what she had made of herself in his memory, and the realization did not bring guilt but rather a strange, fierce determination, and she thought, I am 26 years old, and I have been dead for 3 years, and it is time to learn to live again. The grey dress lay in her wardrobe, where she had left it weeks ago, and Eleanor lifted it out with trembling hands, the fabric soft and unfamiliar after so long in unrelieved black, and she dressed slowly, fastening each button as though performing some sacred ritual. And when she looked at herself again, the woman in the mirror seemed less ghostly, the grey somehow bringing colour back to her skin, a hint of the roses that had once bloomed in her cheeks. And it was not black, but neither was it the full spectrum of colour. It was compromise. It was transition. It was a first tentative step toward a world she had renounced, and Eleanor wore it down to breakfast where Mrs. Hartwell, her housekeeper, stopped dead in the doorway and pressed one hand to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes, and said, "Oh, my lady." And Eleanor understood that her household had been mourning not Thomas but her, grieving the living ghost she had become. She walked to the village that afternoon, and heads turned as she passed, whispers following in her wake like wind through grass. And Eleanor held her head high, though her heart hammered with anxiety, and she made her way through the churchyard to Thomas's grave, that simple stone marker she had visited weekly for 3 years, and she knelt there in the frozen grass, her grey skirts spreading around her like smoke, and she spoke aloud for the first time, not in her head but with her voice, and she said, "Thomas, I do not know if you can hear me, if some part of you exists beyond this stone, but I need to say this. I loved you. I love you still, and you were my first love and my greatest joy, and I will carry you with me always. But I cannot carry only you. I cannot make my whole life a monument to your death, and I hope you would not want me to." And she wept then, not the bitter tears of the past 3 years, but something cleaner, something that felt like release, and when she rose she felt lighter, as though she had set down a burden she had not known she was carrying, and she whispered, "Goodbye, my love. Not forever, but for now." And she walked home through the winter afternoon and sat at her writing desk and drew out paper and pen and wrote, "Your Grace, I would very much like to see you, if you are willing to receive me. Yours, Eleanor Ashford." And she sealed it and sent it before she could lose her courage, and that night she dreamed of dancing, not with Thomas but with Sebastian, and when she woke her face was wet with tears, but her heart, for the first time in 3 years, felt something that might have been hope. Sebastian's reply came within hours, a simple note that read, "Come today, if you are able. I am always willing." And Eleanor arrived at Hartfield Manor that afternoon, when winter light slanted cold and golden through bare trees, and she stood at the entrance in her grey dress, feeling more exposed than she had ever felt in concealing black. And when Sebastian opened the door himself, rather than waiting for his butler, she saw his eyes travel over her, taking in the grey fabric, the small defiant declaration of change, and something blazed in his face, joy, relief, hope. But he said nothing of it, simply bowed and said, "Eleanor, you are most welcome," and led her not to the library where they had spent so many hours, but to a smaller, more intimate drawing room, where a fire burned bright against the January cold, and he offered her tea, which she accepted, though her hands trembled slightly as she took the cup, and for a long moment they sat in silence that was not uncomfortable but weighted with everything unspoken, and finally Eleanor set down her cup and said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "I wanted to thank you, Your Grace, Sebastian, for your patience, for your kindness, for not turning away when I vanished for all those months." And Sebastian leaned forward, his grey eyes intent on hers, and said, "You needed time. There is no fault in that." And Eleanor shook her head and continued, "I needed more than time. I needed to find my way back to myself, or perhaps to find a new self, one that could hold both grief and joy. And I am not," She paused, searching for words. I am not yet whole. I do not know if I will ever be whole in the way I was before Thomas died, but I am no longer broken, or at least not broken beyond repair. And her voice caught on the last words, but she did not look away from Sebastian's gaze. And he rose then, and crossed to where she sat and knelt before her chair so that his eyes were level with hers, and he took both her hands in his touch warm and solid and real, and he said with quiet intensity, "Eleanor, I have waited, and I will continue to wait as long as you need. There is no hurry, and no pressure. I would rather have your friendship for a lifetime than rush you into anything you are not ready for." And Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, because his generosity was almost more than she could bear. And then Sebastian drew a breath and said, and she could hear the vulnerability in his voice, the risk he was taking, "But I need you to know something, and I will say it only once, and then never again unless you wish to hear it. I love you, Eleanor, not as some damaged thing to be pitied or repaired, not as a replacement for anything or anyone, but as yourself, as the woman you are now with all your scars and strength and complexity. I love the way you think and the way you see the world. I love your loyalty and your courage, and if you can never return that love, I will accept it, but I needed you to know it exists." And Eleanor sat frozen, her hands clasped in his, and she felt the truth of his words settle into her bones, felt the absoluteness of his regard, and what she experienced then was not the panic she might have expected, but rather a deep, aching tenderness, and she thought of the months he had waited, the gentleness with which he had guided her back toward life, never pushing, always offering, and she realized that she did love him, perhaps not with the uncomplicated passion she had felt for Thomas at 19, but with something deeper, something earned through patience and built on genuine understanding. And she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need more time, Sebastian, not because I do not care for you, but because I want to come to you freely, without guilt, without reservation, and I am not quite there yet." And Sebastian's face showed no disappointment, only acceptance, and he lifted her hands and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture of such old-fashioned courtliness that it made her heart ache, and he said, "Then take the time you need, I am not going anywhere." And Eleanor left Hartfield that evening as twilight turned the winter sky to violet and gold, and she carried with her the words, "I love you," and they glowed inside her chest like embers, warming her against the cold. 3 months passed, and winter yielded to spring, and Eleanor emerged from her cocoon of grief, like something being slowly, painfully born into a world she had renounced. And the transformation was neither swift nor simple, but rather a series of small, deliberate choices that accumulated into something larger than their parts. And the first choice was color, not the sudden embrace of scarlet or gold, but the gradual introduction of lavender, pale gray that was almost silver, dove-colored silk that whispered against her skin like a promise. And Mrs. Hartwell wept openly the first time Eleanor came down to breakfast in a dress the color of early twilight, and the village noticed too, heads turning as she walked to the bookshop or the milliner's, and the whispers changed from pitying to curious to something almost approving, and Eleanor felt their attention like sunlight on skin too long kept in shadow, uncomfortable at first but increasingly welcome, and she began to accept invitations she would have refused months before tea with the vicar's wife, a small dinner party at the Thorntons' estate where she had not set foot since Thomas's death, and at that dinner she sat across from Sebastian, who had also been invited, and their eyes met over candlelight and wine, and something passed between them that made Eleanor's breath catch, and afterward Lady Thornton said to her husband, "Mark my words, we shall have a wedding before the year is out," and she was not wrong to think it. For anyone who saw them together could see the careful courtship unfolding like the spring itself, gradual but inexorable, and Sebastian was patience incarnate, never pushing, always offering, and when Eleanor mentioned in passing that she had once enjoyed watercolors, he gifted her an entire set of paints and fine paper, and when she expressed concern about the orphanage in the village, he invited her to join him in administering a charitable trust, and suddenly they were partners in something larger than themselves, meeting twice weekly to review applications and distribute funds, and the work gave Eleanor purpose beyond her own grief, reminded her that the world continued to turn and that she might yet have a place in it, and the community watched this partnership with knowing eyes. saw how Sebastian's hand would linger on Eleanor's when he helped her into her carriage, how her face would light with genuine pleasure when he entered a room, and spring deepened into April and then May. And one morning Eleanor woke to birdsong and walked to her wardrobe and stood there looking at the progression of dresses, black at one end, then grey, then lavender, then the pale blue she had commissioned last week but had not yet dared to wear, and she thought of Sebastian's words, "I love you as yourself, not as some damaged thing to be repaired," and she thought of the white roses he had shown her in his garden a year ago, white for mourning transformed, and she took down the blue dress and put it on, and it was the colour of forget-me-nots, the colour of clear sky, and when she looked in the mirror, she saw not a ghost but a woman, still scarred but no longer broken, still carrying grief but no longer consumed by it, and she went down to breakfast with her heart beating hard and fast, and Mrs. Hartwell saw the dress and smiled through tears, and Eleanor said, "I think I am ready," and Mrs. Hartwell understood, though Eleanor had not specified ready for what, and that afternoon Eleanor walked in her garden among the spring flowers, waiting, because somehow she knew that Sebastian would come, that he had been waiting for some sign that she had reached the other side of her long winter, and she was not wrong, for as the afternoon sun slanted golden through the trees, she saw his figure at the garden gate, and he was carrying white roses, and Eleanor's breath stopped in her throat, and she thought, "Yes, now, finally, I am ready." The morning arrived gilt-edged and perfect, May in its full glory, 3 years and 3 months to the day since Thomas had been lost to the sea, and Eleanor woke with the certainty that this was the day something would change, must change, had already begun changing the moment she had seen Sebastian at her garden gate the previous afternoon, and she dressed with trembling fingers in the pale blue gown, the colour of forget-me-nots and clear skies and hope, and she went down to the garden, where spring had exploded in a riot of colour she was finally able to see, truly see, without guilt shadowing every blossom, and she was standing among the roses when she heard the gate, and she turned to find Sebastian there in the morning light, formal in his dark coat, and he was carrying white roses, a dozen of them, the variety he had cultivated, the ones he had shown her a year ago when she had still been drowning, and Eleanor's heart began to beat so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. And Sebastian walked toward her slowly, his grey eyes never leaving her face, and when he reached her he said, "You are wearing blue," and his voice was rough with emotion, and Eleanor nodded, unable to speak, and Sebastian said, "Eleanor, I came here today with a question, but first I need to tell you what I see when I look at you. I see a woman of extraordinary courage, who loved deeply enough to grieve deeply, who honored her vows even beyond death, but who has found the strength to choose life again. And that strength, that choice, is perhaps the bravest thing I have ever witnessed." And Eleanor felt tears begin to slip down her cheeks, and Sebastian set down the roses carefully on the garden bench, and then, to her shock and wonder, he lowered himself to one knee there among the flowers, and he took her hand in both of his, and he said, "Eleanor Ashford, I am asking you to marry me, but I am asking you for more than that. I am asking you to choose life fully, to step out of the shadows and into the sun, to believe that you deserve happiness, and that accepting it is not betrayal, but rather the highest form of honoring what you have lost." And Eleanor could barely breathe, her hand trembling in his, and Sebastian reached into his coat and withdrew not a ring but a length of fabric, white silk that caught the morning light and seemed to glow, and he said, "I am asking you to wear white for me, Eleanor, not to erase your past. Your past is part of you, and I would never ask you to deny it, but to embrace your future, our future, to let white be what I told you it could be. Not the absence of mourning, but mourning transformed, grief acknowledged and honored, and finally, gently, released." And he looked up at her with such love, such patient, enduring love that had waited through her winter, and asked nothing but that she find her way back to herself. And Eleanor felt something break open inside her chest, the last frozen chamber of her heart thawing at last, and she thought of Thomas, and she felt no guilt, only gratitude for what they had shared, and a quiet certainty that he would want this for her, he would want her to live. And she drew Sebastian to his feet and said, her voice breaking but clear, "Yes, Sebastian, yes to all of it, yes to marriage, and yes to life, and yes to white, to transformation, to new beginnings, to love that honors all that came before while reaching toward all that might yet be. And Sebastian's face blazed with joy, and he pulled her into his arms and held her as she wept. Tears that were grief and relief and hope all mingled together. And when she finally pulled back, he lifted the white silk and draped it over her shoulders like a blessing, and Eleanor looked down at the white against her blue dress and thought, I am no longer a ghost, I am a woman, alive and loved, and ready at last to step fully into the light.